Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report for the Jurisdictional command of Bakunin. In this video, we'll be talking about who Bakunin is, how do they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and general faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army as usual to go through a lot of the profiles that showcase how that identity works in play. Now, before we begin, big thanks to a couple of channel supporters who have made requests for this as a video topic, including Isaac Tamat and Lindsay Stussy. Very high likelihood that I've mispronounced one or both of those names, but thank you both for the requests for Jurisdictional Command of Bakunin as a faction focus. Just as a quick reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Now, Bakunin are a faction that received a rework in kind of mid to late N4 that they benefited hugely from. To this day, you will still hear Bakunin-style rework used kind of as a synonym for a really good rework of the faction that overhauls it in a significant way that ultimately produces a well-rounded and feature-complete sectoral. And those bones have translated very well into the new edition. Like every faction, though, there have been both the effect of rebalances of profiles. Some things maybe that didn't work super well in N4 have been bumped up a little bit. A few things that have been overperforming may have been toned down, but also they're a faction that's been heavily affected by the underlying mechanical changes to the game, both in the broad sense of just kind of how the meta works at time of recording in late 2025, but also how things like fireteams and frenzy work in N5. Bakunin were a faction that have historically always traded very heavily on the points discount of frenzy on models, making for some very efficient, in particular heavy infantry. That's kind of less the case now, as Frenzy has been removed from one or two key pieces in the faction, but they are still a faction with a lot of access to frenzied discounted heavy infantry, but who now have to account for that frenzy rather than just ignoring it thanks to link team mechanics. And it's in that first thing that we kind of see what is the beginning of the identity for Bakunin in N5. And I would posit that that identity, kind of apropos of the faction, is of lots of interesting internal tensions and contradictions, which is very apropos for Bakunin and their theme and how they're built as a society. And so, in the spirit of that, rather than doing what I would usually do, which is list a bunch of strengths and then a bunch of limitations and try and tie that together, we are going to go through a bunch of important and powerful things that Bakunin has, but then for each of those, talk about how there is kind of a mirroring contradiction that you have to manage if you are playing the faction. And so the first of those is that Bakunin is a faction with fantastic frenzy discounted troops, but you have to manage that frenzy, and there are some interesting tools to do so, up to and including taking flash pulse arrows in order to avoid triggering frenzy. But while it is still a very powerful attribute of the faction, it's no longer a free ride. We see it in link teams as well. The things that you can link and the fire teams that you can perform, like can form in Bakunin, are tremendously cool, and they're supplemented by really solid unlinked pieces as well. However, good lord, in this faction are we gagging for more fire team slots. I don't think there is any faction in the entire game that wants to be able to put together 3 or even 4, like 3 or 4 person teams, like Morat Aggression Force sort of can, and which can't. Bakunin are strongly limited to one fireteam core, one fireteam Haris, and without a lot of appealing duos, we really have to choose in our list constructions how we make the absolute most use that we can out of the sharply limited 2, 3 or more person fire teams. There are just loads of really compelling options in this space, and you have to just pick 2. And that is difficult, but you get to pick 2 usually incredible fire teams. This is also a faction that should just never ever struggle to hit 15 troops. There are tons of excellent pieces at the very cheap baseline, from 9-point regular order generating moderators to 6-point Morlocks. Bakunin can absolutely swim in cheap troops to hit that 15 order mark. However, there are also a lot of really compelling 20, 30, 40, and tag level price point things that you can't all fit in a list. Especially with some of the more premier, like medium infantry that you do kind of really want, Bakunin never quite feels like it runs away into Invincible Army territory, even when the bones of the faction, the very cheap and cheerful elements, should on paper feel like they should let us escape into a like multiple very powerful HI situation. Bakunin are also a faction with what I would call overall good but not great gunfighting. There is a lot of Mimetism 6 or at least Mimetism 3 in this faction. You also have very easy, some of the cheapest access to white noise in the entire game. And if you really stretch for it, you can even do smoke shooting on a Mimetism armor-piercing platform. But also, good lord, this is a faction that is mostly constrained to ballistic skill 12 and 13. And so that can mean that while Bakunin can be very hard to grapple with because they have particularly like Mimetism 6 heavy infantry, Mimetism 6 primary gunfighters, Mimetism 3 ARO pieces and gunfighting pieces. When you are playing as Bakunin and go to take a swing, you will regularly find that what you're rolling for are most of the time 13s before any visibility mods on your opponent's part. And so you have an army that gunfights well, but sometimes takes like one more order than you would like compared to something like a Pan-Oceanian player. A Pan-Oceanian player running things like Hetkari, Apex Gunfighter can expect to win face-to-face rolls in one go. Bakunin can expect to win gunfights, but maybe take one more order to do it. Up next, as a Nomad faction, Bakunin are a hacking faction. They are a good hacking faction, but there's internal tension and contradiction here as well. Bakunin has probably the best network projection in the entire game, if not in terms of actual high watermark pieces, then at least in terms of just a glut of top-notch options. I genuinely don't think there's any faction in the game that has as many different choices for getting a hacking network forward than Bakunin does. And most of them are good or at least viable options. But in terms of the hackers that Bakunin has access to, they're good, but there's nothing that's quite matching the efficiency, for example, of a Tunguska Interventor. And in particular, what you will find is that the killer hacking presence in Bakunin, absolutely present. There are multiple killer hackers that you can choose from, but none of them are really Apex Predator pieces. Probably the best is going to be the Custodier, and she is going to be significantly outperformed by any of the real Apex killer hackers in the game, and especially outperformed by something like an Interventor KHD. She can do the job, but she's willpower 14 with no special modifiers and not particularly high BTS. She's just good enough, particularly when stacked with a firewall bonus, which places Bakunin very much as kind of an upper middle power in terms of the hacking game. They can punch down very well. If they want to establish that network, they're very, very good at that. Then capitalizing on that, they have to hope that they're not playing into an opposing Apex Predator that can neutralize their hackers, or especially fight off their killer hackers. Bakunin are also a faction where you will just find yourself accidentally having close combat, like good close combat, on multiple models in every single list. I am pretty sure it is just about impossible to build a Bakunin list that doesn't have multiple things that can really slap in close combat. But it's all that kind of like punch down close combat. We're talking things that are sitting about 22cc, martial arts 1 or 2. There are very few martial arts 3 and nothing higher, and only a very small number of pieces that want to go into a fight with an enemy apex close combatant. The Uberfall Commando does exist, and she is your best piece for that, but even she fights those kind of close combats in an unfair way, trading out pupniks for a kill on an enemy CC expert, rather than trying to fight that enemy CC expert herself in N5. In N4, she could absolutely do that. In N5, she's still very good in close combat, but much more fair. And so what we end up with when we sort of look back on all of those combined strengths and limitations in Bakunin is a faction where the breadth is significant. Not for no reason is the Bakunin style rework talking about getting a sectorial that is feature complete and broad and has lots of things going on. But in N5, it is also a faction where every list forces interesting and necessary compromises. You never have that situation where you absolutely get to have your cake and eat it too, across like multiple axes of the game. You're always making small but necessary compromises that nevertheless produce lists that are very, very solid. I would say that kind of on their release at the apex of their power back in N4, there was a pretty good argument that Bakunin were kind of like almost a borderline S tier faction. At the moment in N5, I would say they aren't that, but they are an extremely firm, solid A tier faction. There is almost nothing that you can't do with Bakunin if you really set your mind to it. They have access to every kind of troop that you might want in the game. They can play at a variety of different ranges and different styles. But there is never a Bakunin list that you will build that you can't look at and go, man, with like 50 points and one more fire team, I would be broken as hell. Overall, that means, well, firstly, that they are a balanced success despite being very powerful and very interesting, but they are very powerful and very interesting. They're a compelling faction. They're feature complete. You can easily play them as a standalone faction without necessarily having to expand into nomads, or they can act as a springboard into the broader nomad faction if you're so inclined. And with that firm recommendation in hand, let's jump into Infinity Army and go through just a lot of different profiles because there is a lot to talk about. Now we're going to start, as usual, with our fire teams and as usual with our line infantry fire team. But before we dive into moderators, we really do need to talk about how fire teams work in Bakunin and how Bakunin fire teams are excellent, but also one of the limitations the faction has to handle. Thanks to how fireteam bonuses work in N5, smaller fireteams that still get at least that minimum level of bonus from having two of the same troop types have emerged as a very appealing configuration, sometimes scaling up when it's worthwhile, but that like 3-person fireteam or 2-person fireteam that gets full bonuses are amongst the most popular configurations, at least that I've observed in this edition. And one of the benefits and limitations to Bakunin is that they have a lot of different configurations, especially at that 3 troopers, 2 of whom are configuring to give you fireteam bonuses level, but they don't have, firstly, many really appealing duos, and they also only have 1 fireteam core and 1 fireteam Haris. On top of that, there are some particularly interesting options that are configured only to work in a fireteam Haris. No option to do the like Haris or duo. You are locked into the Haris slot in particular. And that means that Bakunin has to be very judicious when they're figuring out how to set up their fire teams in any given list construction. And that has an effect on moderators because moderators are, in theory, fantastic list fodder. 2 of them for 18 points gives you 2 regular orders, 2 dudes with combi rifles, only ballistic skill 10 obviously, but also 2 dudes who are linkable and who could form the basis of a fairly cheap fire team, perhaps with an attached gun of some description, and that's absolutely the case. But when we get to one of the lists that we will, or the list that we will showcase at the end of this video, we will notice an absence of moderator fire teams, even though that's very appealing. And that's ultimately going to come down to the fact that you just have to make choices, and sometimes there's going to be things that will be higher impact that will zone a moderator out of being a link team option. Now, they're still excellent to have access to, but as we talk through the moderators themselves and all of the things that can join them, and it is such a long list of things that you can join them, keep in mind that we will also be weighing all of those fireteam configurations against other equally competitive things that form from the basis of Riot Girl, Reverend and Observant, and even Morlock or Taskmaster fire teams that might edge these guys out of being in your list as a fire team setup. Nevertheless, there are a bunch of useful options in moderators for Bakunin themselves. The most common, really, are going to be the Lieutenant with Combi Rifle, because it is a very cheap Willpower 13 Lieutenant, and therefore the 9-point regular Combi Moderator, because it is an extremely cheap regular order who is a Lieutenant Decoy. Things to note about the Moderator's attributes is that they're very low ballistic skill and they're very low armor, but BTS3 has some merits on some profiles, and they're surprisingly difficult to kill in close combat. CC18 and a Paris CCW will occasionally come up, and on those occasions it will be when some close combat expert runs mistakenly into CC with a moderator, at which point they are informed, "Sir, this is a Wendy's, put in a headlock and left in the para state while help arrives from somewhere else." Now, moderators aren't true close combat experts, but they are just good enough at CC, particularly with that para CCW, that on those opponents, when your opponent does get into close combat with them, they're left wondering, do I really keep spending orders here? Now, there are some gunfighting profiles, but we probably don't want to take many or any of them. Like, don't take that Spitfire, for example. As cheap as it is, it's ballistic skill 10. You probably also want to avoid the pitcher for the same reason. But if we are actually running a moderator fire team, you could consider it. 10 points is very cheap for a linkable pitcher. Finally, the paramedic is a cheap specialist, and the hacker is also a cheap specialist. 14 points puts it at about as cheap as you can reasonably pay for a hacker in this game, and this is where we see the attributes that moderators have really does nothing bad for the hacker. In practice, that hacker is a 14-point, Whip 13, BTS 3 hacker, and those are the only attributes you really care about for a model like that. Very cheap, very efficient hacker, could very easily just slap one of those in a list for a little bit more network capitalization, in a list that's making lots of use of Bakunin's various network projection options. Now, if we're running moderators as a fire team, what we're going to be looking for are two models at least that count as moderators, and much of the time that will just be the moderators themselves, but also spare a thought towards Bakunin clockmakers. These guys are linkable, and most importantly, in addition to being one of the best engineers in the game, they count as moderators for fireteam composition bonuses, which means you can very easily have a fireteam that consists of one moderator of any sort, could be a 9-point generic, could be a hacker, one clockmaker with whatever it is that you would like, but usually you'll pick the cheapest profile because armed turrets are a little bit naff right now, and then wildcard in one of the two combat remotes that can join that team. The Vostok is obviously the better gunfighter. We extolled its virtues in the Tunguska video, but just to recap, it has a reasonably large gun, it costs no SWC, it's 35 points, and it has mimetism -6. And since it's a remote presence tag, putting it in a fire team with an engineer is really good. And that's something that Bakunin can do that Tunguska can't. Tunguska might be taking an engineer for other reasons, but in Bakunin, we can just staple the engineer directly to the combat remote, and because they're in the same fire team, the Vostok can run out of repair reach of the Clockmaker, but you just have a great linked combat remote and one of the best engineers in the game. The other option, in addition to the Vostok, just the same as in Tunguska, is the Cyclone Sputnik. That Cyclone being single wound is a little bit of a downside, but since it's remote presence and we will have an engineer right there in the fire team with it, that's not really the end of the world. And being a 1 SWC gun in particular, in a faction that has lots of ways to spend its SWC, is kind of nice. Now, I'm not reaching for the Cyclone as much in Bakunin as I am in, say, Tunguska, because many of those other ways to spend SWC are really quite good gunfighters. And one thing I really don't need in Bakunin is even more fantastic ways to fire pitches out into the midfield. But particularly in an info war dominance list, nothing wrong with the Cyclone at all. And it's really not that expensive at 28 points. You get what is ultimately a very well-rounded fire team by taking a moderator hacker, a clockmaker engineer, and a Cyclone Sputnik. That's not particularly expensive. It has multiple different ways to be useful, and it self-reconstitutes, making it one of those ideal kind of like combat group 2 fire teams, and the kind of fire teams that I would put in lots of lists, if not for the fact that, oh god, please just give me one more Haris team in Bakunin. Now, there are a few other things that we should just mention as being able to join moderator fire teams. One is Wolfgang Wolf, who is notable because he counts as a moderator, which means that you could theoretically do some interesting things that maybe even involve just having Wolf and one moderator, like make a team of 3 and then have Wolf and one moderator run into the midfield. Again, would be very appealing if there were more fire team choices, like in terms of number of fire teams that you could take. But ultimately, I do think in Bakunin, Wolf is edged out a little bit by more competitive options, rendering him a little bit of a vanity pick. There will always be people for whom he's just their boy, but he's definitely in that, oh, hear me out, vanity pick category of units. Casino security rounders can also join fire teams in Bakunin if you have a couple of moderators or moderator equivalents to join them. And while a marksmanship MSV1 linked multi-marksman rifle or Red Fury is a little bit appealing, ultimately we are still kind of talking about a unit that needs to occupy a fire team slot in a faction for which those fire team slots are very congested. But one option that we might consider, just joining a fire team of a couple perhaps of very cheap moderators, maybe just your lieutenant and their decoy, you might consider the more expensive 25-point Orphan of the Observance. Now, Orphans are a unit that we'll actually have to come back to a couple of different times because they can join many different fire teams. But in a fire team core with a couple of moderators, we should give at least a little bit of thought to the multi-marksman. This profile is the only MSV2 in the entire faction. And while Ballistic Skill 12 is not fantastic, 25 points is a very reasonable price point, particularly given that it's Mimetism 3. This is the kind of piece that you can just dedicate a Morlock, or perhaps a Zellenkrieger to throwing smoke, and stacking a -9 modifier onto things like enemy total reaction bots firing back at you. Now, ultimately, this is not a piece that I, for example, will reach for in the list we're showing off at the end of this video, but in some Bakunin list, this is something that you could consider if you were particularly interested in smoke shooting. Now, given how much Mimetism 6 and white noise we have access to in Bakunin, I'm not quite as hard on shooting through smoke as I am in some other factions, but if you want to do that, well, we have it on a Mimetism 3 model, and that model is linkable if Ballistic Skill 12. Now, from the Moderator fire team, trying to move at a good clip here because there are a lot of units to go through because this is a very broad faction, we get to what used to be the oldest and biggest staple of Bakunin and who now take slightly of a backseat, the Riot Girls. Now, Riot Girls can form core, Haris, and duo fire teams, and are probably the only fire team duo outside of the occasional tag fire team that we can actually really make good use of in this faction. And that just immediately puts them in something of a niche, just because of how rare it is to find a good third fire team, or fourth fire team in some cases, but a good extra fire team in this faction that is struggling so mightily under the restriction of just one Haris and just one core. You can do actually a very good fire team core out of the Riot Girls, I would say core, because then that frees up the Haris slot. There's one very appealing model in particular that was really nice to link with Riot Girls, but who doesn't contribute to link bonuses. But the Riot Girls themselves, look, they're just solid on their merits. This is probably the regiment that most felt the Frenzy rule changes in N5, both positive and negative. Frenzy now, obviously, when it triggers, gives you impetuous and limited cover rather than no cover, which is much better, like to have limited rather than no cover. But on the other hand, you no longer get to suppress Frenzy while you're in a fire team, and that was the bread and butter of Riot Girls. What that means is that we have to be kind of a bit more judicious with how we use pieces like this. But despite that rules change, these are all still quite appealing profiles. Riot Girls have 6-2 movement, which is fantastic. They dodge very well. They have Ballistic Skill 13 and an MSV1, which is good enough as far as gunfighting goes. And they have the really nice Ballistic Skill attack SR-1, which means all of these weapons, down to the humble boarding pistols that they are all carrying, meaning they all have template attacks, have just that bit of extra damage to capitalize on any successful gunfights. Now, there's basically no faction, no profile here, rather, that I couldn't see myself using in some list. The niche of the Specialist Operative is that you can duo it and have link bonuses, although there are some other things that we might choose to do that with instead, but an emitter is a really good weapon. The Spitfire and Missile Launcher are both viable weapons in different cases. Spitfire is probably my preferred go-to because it is damage 5, and the Missile Launcher, sometimes you do just really want an MSV ARO piece, but because once she does a point of damage to something at the end of the round, she'll trigger Frenzy, she's a bit more single use than I would necessarily like. She's kind of easy to deal with after she triggers Frenzy, but she is easily the most robust MSV ARO piece we have access to in the faction, so worth considering for that reason. The multi-rifle and disco baller has a multi-rifle and disco ball, and the boarding shotgun with Tinbot is an excellent choice if we are running a 3-person team with Uhahu. Now, the big problem with Uhahu is that she doesn't count as a Riot Girl, and there are a couple of other things that do that open up duo options. If you want to link Uhahu to a point where she and the other members in the fire team get special die bonuses, you have to be at least a 3-person team, which means we're back to impinging on that rough limit that Bakunin has on how many teams they can field. That's the only downside. Everything else about her is just ridiculously efficient. Mostly because she just isn't paying for a gun outside of the assault pistol, Uhahu is a no wound incapacitation, hacking device plus, shock immune, willpower 14 BTS 3 hacker with a pitcher and decharges for half an SWC and 19 points. That's just obscenely cheap for that package. She's one of the best value hackers in the entire game. It's not close, and you should take her in lists even if you aren't linking her. It's just that linking her is really nice because then you get a linked picture. Now, Ballistic Skill 11 is not the end of the world. She can take shots if she needs to, even if you're just not using the picture with her and just being like, yeah, I paid 19 points for an incredible hacker. Oh, what's like other factions? They pay 13 points. 14 points for very efficient hacking in the form of things like a Celestial Guard. I'll pay 5 more and get so many upgrades. She's really, really, really good. She's especially good because white noise combines really nicely with Mimetism 6, meaning that you just always get to slap negative modifiers on your opponent, and God help your opponent if they're a marksmanship trooper, because then you get the best of all worlds. But she's also notable for being linkable with the Riot Girls. It's just that if you want to get the full benefit from there, you have to start doing things like taking a third member. Now, that could very easily be a Riot Girl Spitfire, a Riot Girl Tinbot -6, and Uhahu. That is a hell of a fire team. There are also a couple of other options as well. And these come in the form of our surprisingly elite specialists, Avicenna and Fiddler. Now, I'll keep Avicenna on screen. Fiddler, you should know who she is. She's in a bunch of different factions. Avicenna and Fiddler both count as Riot Girls in a Riot Girls fire team. Both of these troops are fast enough to easily keep up with Riot Girls as they're moving across the field. In fact, Fiddler is faster. And both of them are high-value specialists. Fiddler is an engineer with decharges, Avicenna is an excellent doctor. And so a fire team that is definitely worth considering in a lot of Bakunin lists is just, for example, something like a Riot Girl Spitfire and Avicenna. That is one of the rare examples of a non-tag fire team duo that you can actually run in this faction. And while Bakunin is absolutely not struggling at all for cool independent models, this is kind of an addition of fireteam duo, and this is one of the few good fireteam duos that you can run in Bakunin. Now, it is obviously a little bit pricey because Avicenna is not cheap, and Riot Girls, although they're good value, aren't necessarily cheap either, but it's a burst 5 gun. It's a very high willpower specialist, it's good force reconstitution, and Avicenna herself is actually surprisingly durable under certain circumstances because she has no wound incapacitation and immunity armor, and if she's caught in a face-to-face roll, she'll often be responding with a willpower 15 flash pulse. Now, from the Moderator and Riot Girl fire teams, we are back in Core and Haris territory only, with the Reverend and Observance fire teams. Now, these look like they're very similar, and there's a fair bit of overlap, but there are actually a few pieces that are limited to just one or the other that significantly affects how each of these is configured. In the Reverend's fire team, starting with some models that are unique to that, we begin with Reverend Moira's. Now, Infinity, just as a game, at least for as long as I have been playing, which is 3 editions now, is a game where medium infantry aren't very good. Reverend Moira's buck that trend. They don't buck it by a ton, but they're just good enough that one, sometimes two in a list has some value. They are expensive. They are as expensive as many multi-wound models, and they have just one wound. But noting that limitation, what you do get is a fair amount for the cost. Now, Ballistic Skill 12 isn't fantastic, but Mimetism -6 goes an awfully long way in turning, particularly the higher burst Moiras into very serviceable gunfighters, particularly at the head of fire teams. And thanks to how many really cool things can join a Reverend's fire team, it's actually not going to be terribly uncommon if you have a Moira as a gunfighter to get up to Ballistic Skill 13 from the 4-person fire team bonus. Mimetism 6, as noted, is excellent. Sixth Sense is really quite good as well. And NCO is an especially nice skill. Now there's like one or two choices for active lieutenants in Bakunin, but moderator lieutenants remain very appealing. And given that a lot of the active lieutenants want to join a fire team anyway, having just one NCO is really valuable. It's effectively a free order in Bakunin, and so I kind of rate Reverend Moira's just for that. I prefer to take the gunfighting profiles, heavy machine gun and or multi-sniper. I think if you're paying that much for this kind of a profile with Mimetism 6, you may as well be using them to gunfight. But you will occasionally see, particularly the discounted Specialist Operative Lieutenant profile, in lists to fill out links sometimes as well. For me though, it's the big guns here that see the most use, but don't forget that all of these have zappers, and a zapper is a short-range EM template weapon which can be really, really valuable. Ultimately, this is a unit I have to be very careful not to oversell because they're single wound. But subject to that limitation, they have some good applications. Next up, in terms of troops that are limited to the Reverend's fire team, we have the Reverend Healer. She's an expensive doctor, but she's Mimetism 6, and she has an emitter. It's usually that 29-point profile that you'll be taking. I would not really be aiming for the multi-rifle, although it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. What we're really looking to do here is have a Ballistic Skill 12 linked Mim 6 emitter, who is also a doctor. At that point, actually this isn't a terrible package. We add her in with a fire team core consisting of other models. She'll often be getting up to Ballistic Skill 13, and 3 dice with that emitter while you have neg 6 on the enemy, doing things like just putting tags in an uncomfortable spot. That's just kind of good to have. On top of that, since she's going to be linked with models that are mostly shock immune, Having access to a good doctor is nice, and she's a +1 burst medikit, meaning she's going to be going up to 3 dice if she's linked, in a faction that has tons of things like Morlocks, who are kind of easy to recover with a medikit from downrange. So just a fairly useful piece, but with a very significant price tag. Even the cheapest one is 29 points, and it's pieces like Moira's and Reverend Healers, where we see how the strain on Bakunin points can emerge even when we have such good cheap models like Moderators and Morlocks. Now, the final trooper that is unique to the Reverend's fireteam and can't join an observance fireteam are Reverend Custodiers, and these are probably the best hackers in faction. Now, that is absolutely not to say that these are bad hackers, but what we do have here just a little bit is the curse of the multi-role model. If we compare these to interventors from Tunguska, there is just a huge delta in how much they cost versus how good they are at hacking. Interventors are vastly more efficient. But of course they are. They aren't paying for anything other than hacking ability. The Reverend Custodiers, by comparison, well, they have Ballistic Skill 12 pitches, and Armor 3, and Ballistic Skill 12, and Shock Immunity, and Mimetism -6. Now that Mim 6 sometimes, if it's a hacker, is just never going to come up. Very occasionally, however, it will. Ultimately, when we're thinking about Reverend Custodiers, what we want to do is just put the cross-faction comparison aside, because it's not actually particularly meaningful here, and think about how do they fit into the broader context of the faction. And ultimately, especially the Killer Hacker, but also to an extent the Lieutenant, the Hacking Device Plus, or any of the Hacking Device profiles, do possess that wonderful combination of linkability, decent ballistic skill, a pitcher, and a hacker all in one piece. Certainly, I would take these over Drew's, for example, if we're going to do cross-faction comparisons the other way, and Drew's hackers aren't even considered particularly bad given what it is that they do. The main thing to be aware of is that we're going to be pretty limited in this faction in terms of especially how many good killer hackers we have access to. While there are ample profiles in total that have access to hacking devices and killer hackers, there's really nothing that's high watermark or apex predator. Pretty much as good as it's going to get is the Reverend Custodier. Willpower 14, BTS 3, firing through a pitcher. That she's fired off herself is as good as killer hacking gets in Bakunin. And while it's absolutely not bad, it's not high watermark in the game. But if we want to win a hacking duel, we kind of need that capability in there. And so I do, if you can find the fireteam slot, sometimes even if you can't, strongly recommend at least the KHD. However, it would also be absolutely possible to build Bakunin lists that get all of their network projection elsewhere, and then just do things like roll up with 0 KHDs under a marker state, hoping that Willpower 13, BTS 0, and Surprise is enough to do it. Now, continuing the list of models that can be in a Reverend's fireteam, but which can also join an Observance fireteam, Reverend Cenobites. Now, these things, they're, they're really good. If you have a long-time Bakunin opponent, particularly one who's been playing since the N4 rework, you will have to have developed tools to deal with these things, whether they be play or mechanical, because it's just rare to see a Bakunin list that doesn't at least try and use these things. They are as balanced as they have ever been in N5, because Frenzy does finally matter, but the total package, especially on the cheapest Chain Rifle and Flash Pulse profile, is just hot damn. So what have we got here? 6-2 movement, outstanding, particularly on a close combat model. And this is a close combat model because it is CC22 with Martial Arts 3 and a decent DA CCW, actually making this one of the better close combatants in the faction and certainly good enough to go into and win face-to-face rolls against any non-expert close combat model. We've also got a +1 burst chain pipe rifle and a +1 burst heavy pistol, meaning that this thing can close assault at ballistic skill range, like that 8-inch range, very comfortably. And it's a multi-wound heavy infantry trooper with Mimetism 6. For 20 points, that is just an insane deal. And what is nominally balancing it is Frenzy. In previous edition, Frenzy basically didn't exist on these things. Now it does, but, and we see something quite interesting here, it's got a Flash Pulse, which means that if you need to, you can always just ARO with the Flash Pulse, knowing that you therefore won't inflict any damage and therefore can't trigger Frenzy. You might actually not mind too much because the Cenobite is the kind of piece where if it does trigger Frenzy, it's probably going to result in the Cenobite running forward and killing something, so even that's not too bad. Now, we do still see the heavy rocket launcher used as an ARO piece, Because the Cenobite counts as a Reverend, it's quite easy to get it into a 4 or even 5-person fire team, at which point it's 1 dice plus 1 special dice in ARO, Ballistic Skill 13, Mimetism 6. The only downside is, yes, you're going to proc Frenzy doing that at some point, but it was only 26 points. It still only got limited cover, which is not the end of the world. It still has Mimetism -6. You can absolutely still use these things as HRLs. They are AVA3. You will not always take a full 3 of them in a list, because as cheap as they are, there are still demands on your points cost, but you really could do worse than just taking these guys and slapping them into a list and running them almost as kind of solo warbands in some capacity. Just incredible value. One of the greatest tragedies of Bakunin, or perhaps I should say one of the things that keeps the faction remotely balanced, is the fact that Reverend's fire teams can only form Haris and core teams. They can't form duos, which is why we don't have teams of 1 Cenobite and 1 something else tearing across the table being absolute menaces. Now, other pieces that share the Observance and Reverend Fire team are Mother Healer Agatha Warbara. She was incredible in N4, she is merely quite good in N5. Compared to a Reverend Healer, she doesn't have an emitter, she's a little more expensive, but she is faster, she is better in close combat, she has actual martial arts, and she has the Doctor 2 wound skill. That's the main reason you would take her. Like, yes, she's better in close combat, she can slap someone if she really needs to, but she's single wound. I'm not rearing to run her into CC with something, particularly if it has a template weapon. Where she comes into her own, if she is around anything that is a 2 wound model that is likely to go down, because Doctor 2 wounds in that case has an awful lot of value. Ultimately, though, something of a niche piece, even if she plays quite nicely in either of the 2 fire teams she can join, just because, look, 31 points for an Armor 3 BTS 6, yes, but single wound model has to really justify itself. She's a little bit more of a vanity pick, as good as she was in prior editions. You can absolutely make her work. She'll be back-breaking on that turn that she brings a Cenobite back on full health, but she's not guaranteed to have that happen, and she is more than 10% of your entire army. Finally, Cassandra Kusanagi, sharing both Reverend and Observance fire team statuses. Although she counts as a Reverend, she doesn't count as an Observance model. But you might genuinely actually consider just not running her in a fire team. That's actually an option, as good as she is in either fire team, because Kusanagi is one of those pieces that we really can call a fire team in a can. She is all in one profile for actually a very reasonable points package, durable thanks to no wound incapacitation and shock immunity with decent armor and decent DTS. She's basically as durable as many heavy infantry, and a fantastic gunfighter because I think she's one of only 2 ballistic skill 14 models in the entire faction, and the other one is a tag. And that ballistic skill really matters because she's packing either a burst 4 multi-rifle or more commonly an AP Spitfire, and she has Mimetism 6. Ballistic Skill 14, Burst 4, Mim 6 is just Apex gunfighting territory. That's really, really good, and you can, if you want to, get her up to Burst 5 or 4+1. And on top of all of that, she's a specialist operative, which means that she's just doing everything that you might feasibly need done by herself. The only thing she doesn't have is the ability to throw smoke, and there's plenty of things in this faction that can do that for her. Now, she is only 4/4. So she's not incredibly zippy, which does hold her back from just being taken as a solo piece. The advantage of having her in a fire team is just the order efficiency of the fire team itself, right? Moving forward, making multiple models that might have multiple things to do. If you have a Custodier that wants to move and fire a pitcher, then as part of that you also get movement on Kusanagi, and that's the kind of thing that gets her into range to leverage that Spitfire, for example. As much as she doesn't need to be in a gunfighting team to succeed, she benefits from that order efficiency. But just overall, 35 points for what you get in this package, you can very reasonably salivate at. And while she doesn't appear directly in the list that will show off at the end of this video, there is a very easy switch that you could make to include her, which we'll talk about when we get to the link team at the end of the list at the end of the video. Now, from the Reverend Fire Team into the Observance Fire Team, or perhaps we should more accurately call it the Penitent Observant Fire Team. As mentioned, this fire team can include Mother Agasa and a Kusanagi. It can even include a Moira if you want. It can include Cenobites. It is limited to Haris only, and it has a couple of things that are unique. One of them is the Orphan, which we mentioned previously, but the other, the real thing, is the Penitent Observant. And just what a glow up these things got between editions. I do not remember their N4 profile, but I remember it being on the cusp of glory. In N5, it's glorious. Now, if we compare it directly to Kusanagi, in some respects, even the most attractive profile, which is that bottom profile there, is worse. It's got one less ballistic skill, it has Mimetism 3 rather than Mimetism 6, it is 2 more points, and it's a heavy infantry. Even though it has ECM Hacker, which is fantastic, it can be hacked and Kusanagi can't. However, comma, it has ballistic skill attack continuous damage on an AP Spitfire and its AP Heavy Pistol. In addition, it's a Warhorse, and it is the only Warhorse in the entire faction, and it's a proper heavy infantry, armor 5, BTS 3, and 2 wounds, which means if you have a doctor around, and there are some good doctors in this faction, you might be able to reconstitute it when you couldn't reconstitute Kusanagi. And really, it is the ballistic skill attack, continuous damage, AP Spitfire that is terrifying about this thing. That's a weapon that threatens to one-round anything that it fights, and Burst 4 Ballistic Skill 13 Mimetism with the ability to link is just good enough to land enough shots in any given gunfight that threat's pretty real, shot on shot on shot. These are just really cool. I don't think they are unfair. 37 points for the AP Spitfire is ultimately, it's a very appealing, but it's a reasonable cost. But there is like no list in the entire game that sees one of these things across the table and is able to discount it. It is a threat to everything. It is very dangerous. It is very cool. It will still occasionally just make that ballistic skill 13 gunfighting roll, where you roll a 1, a 2, a 3, an 18, and a 20. That's a thing that happens, but it is at least less susceptible than it is like rocket launchers trying to do the same thing. And I have a lot of time for it. In fact, it's the Penitent Observant that is a significant part of why the Haris slot in Bakunin is so congested, because if you want to link these, you have to use the Haris team because they can't be in a duo and they can't be in a core. Now, we've talked about most of the things that can link with a Penitent, but just to mention the Observants again, Orphans of the Observants can be part of a Penitent fire team, and they count as Observance models, which the Penitent also does, which means you can have a Penitent and an Orphan and then any third trooper, and that 13-point Orphan is a very cheap way to get the fire team bonus for your Cenobite. If the Penitent could duo, we would see any of the specialist profiles slapped onto it all the time, which is probably why we can't see the Penitent duo. Now, 40-something minutes in, and we're still talking about fire teams. We are getting to one of the last fire teams that is nevertheless appealing in Bakunin, and that is the Taskmasters fire team. Now, this team has some limitations, the main one being that there is no real way to get a specialist into it, but what we have in the form of Taskmasters are surprisingly compelling heavy infantry with the Fireteam Master skill. And it's that Fireteam Master that means that even though theoretically we can form a duo here, this guy really wants to be a Haris team if he can. And the fire team that you will usually be taking there is a Taskmaster and 2 Morlocks, turning both of those 6-point Morlocks into regular troopers and giving the entire fire team +1 special die because you have 2 Morlocks in the team. That is really compelling. Even at the most expensive, that's probably only setting you back about 52 points for 3 models, which is well below the average that you want to be spending per trooper. That will give you some free points still to play around if you think about 20 points being the average cost for a trooper in a game of Infinity. And what you get for that is a fairly durable linked heavy infantry that is a mine layer and good at close combat, and all of the benefit that you get from those Morlock groups, which can mean Burst 5 assault pistols. I mean, we'll get to the Morlocks. They're a fantastic warband. If you are anything like me, Fireteam Master is just one of the most like compelling skills in N5. It makes me steeple my fingers and go, excellent, because there's just this like sense of getting free value from turning cheap, fantastic, irregular warbands into cheap, fantastic, linked, regular warbands, particularly given that at any point you need to, you can still impetuous those models forward and go on a regular warband attack run, and they'll be regular for that order if that's relevant as well. Even if, in this case, yes, the actual price point is paying almost 40 points to enter, taking the Fireteam Master in the form of the Taskmaster. Now, relative to the previous edition, a couple of things are kind of worth noting here, and the biggest one is that although the Taskmaster ultimately is still a Ballistic Skill 13, Armor 5, BTS 6 heavy infantry with no special modifiers, Mine Layer is still a fantastic skill, especially on the Crazy Koala. And the Taskmaster is actually just fine in close combat now. CC 22, Stealth, and Martial Arts 1 isn't something that you want to send into anything resembling an elite enemy close combatant, but if you find yourself needing to smoke out and tie down an enemy tag, the Taskmaster is totally fine for that. It's also good enough as a gun platform. I do pretty strongly recommend not taking the heavy rocket launcher profile here. I know, it is the cheapest. I too hear the siren song of the 34-point big gun, but burst 2 plus 1 special die is it's just not enough. It's not enough to consistently win face-to-face rolls. You need, on a model that is only Ballistic Skill 13 with no modifiers, even a model that is Ballistic Skill 13 with some modifiers, just you need slightly more burst than just 2 plus 1 or 3. This isn't even the last time I'm going to mention that in this video, and we won't go on a screed about GoPods because I covered them in the Tunguska video, but just save yourself the pain here and take any of the burst 4 weapons. Frankly, any of them are viable, although I would make the pretty strong case that the strategic deployment model, like 5 points for strategic deployment, that skill is just way too fucking expensive. Even with Morlocks, yes, conceptually cool, there's too much you can do with 5 points to make that worthwhile. But the Red Fury is a 1 SWC gun, and the Crazy Koala it gets, along with the Tinbot, all of those are useful things. And the HMG is, of course, the HMG. You might even fiddle around with taking a lieutenant, perhaps with one moderator as a decoy. Your opponent is pretty likely to think the moderator is your LT and might expend resources going after it, leaving the Taskmaster itself alive. That's a thing you could do in some scenarios, although you need to get use out of the Taskmaster, so there's no chain of command in this faction. Play that one with care. Still, a Taskmaster and 2 Morlocks is pretty fantastic value, and a major contributor to why the Harry slot and core slot are so congested in Bakunin. Now, since we're talking about them, the Morlock group. Easily one of the OG warbands, and still one of the best warbands in the game. Point for point, the only thing I think that realistically competes with them is a Shaolin Monk. Shaolin Monks are better in close combat and have stealth, which is a really big deal on a model that wants to get into CC. The Morlock group, by comparison, is a bit worse in close combat. CC 23 and Martial Arts Level 2 is just fine. That will absolutely let you go after enemy non-experts. The Shaolin, by comparison, can actually take the fight to things that are surprisingly dangerous. But what you get with the Morlock instead is 2 things. The first is metachemistry, which there's no reroll, so you're stuck with whatever you roll. But if you have 2 or 3 Morlocks in a list, one of them's going to high roll something that's fantastic. And there are some really good results in the metachemistry table these days. More consistent and probably more important are the 2 profiles we're most likely to take here. The first is, and the most common, is the assault pistol profile. Now, it only has an APCCW. This makes it worse in CC. But I cannot overstate the value of just randomly slapping a burst 4 weapon onto your 6-point ballistic skill 11 warband. Many have been the games where I have impetuous a Morlock forward and it's fired at something 14 inches away with burst 4, like a flash pulse remote, and just gotten the kill in the impetuous activation at that kind of a distance. Assault pistols are just good weapons, and Morlocks are ballistic skill 11, which means they can actually make use of them. Your odds of winning a gunfight or scoring a crit with such a cheap model, even at mediocre ranges, like the cost benefit is like, oh, well, I might lose the Morlock, or hear me out, what if I was to do a wound to something important and significant and then carry on? It also gives you a really good fork with the chain rifle, although kind of to note, a single template chain rifle is just damage 7. There will be plenty of occasions where it will fail to do something. But yeah, as a default, cannot recommend the assault pistol profile enough. Really think of it primarily as an assault pistol piece that is also packing close combat and smoke and a chain rifle and etc. The other thing that you will take occasionally is the Cobra pistol, don't really care about that, EMCCW. This model still has all of the rest of the kit, and EMCCWs are really good close combat weapons. This one is the one that I would take most often as a one-of in the Taskmaster fireteam, because the Taskmaster will be doing most of the gunfighting. You don't need a Morlock with assault pistol in that team. But having a CCW that will just mess up a tag or an enemy HI or something like that is high value. In either case, we're talking about a 6-point troop. 6 points is fantastic for what you're getting. I really like Morlocks, linked or unlinked. Take them in this faction. Now, just to segue briefly, since we're talking about warbands, there are a lot of warbands in Bakunin. Not all of them are worth taking. We'll kind of skip past most of the Zellenkriegers. I kind of recommend an extreme Zellenkrieger, specifically if you're planning on doing smoke shooting with an orphan, but that is such an extreme niche case that most of the time we won't be taking Morlocks. Morlocks are just out-competed by sorry, Zellenkriegers. Don't take Zellenkriegers. They are out-competed by Morlocks. Morlocks are just better warbands, more well-rounded. A little bit of an exception is Den McConnelly, mostly because he bears a lot more resemblance to a Morlock than a Zellenkrieger. He has metachemistry with reroll, he has a fantastic sort of stat line, he is only single wound, but with reroll there's a very good chance of getting a resiliency skill for him, and he's really quite good in close combat with Natural Born Warrior CC23 Martial Arts 1, a good CCW, and a Chain Rifle +1 burst, and a Heavy Pistol +1 burst. That's kind of what makes the difference, in addition to being 6-2 move and regular. Denma isn't a list that you need in every. You don't need Denma in every list because there are so many other options. But he's a model whose worst possible use case is that he's 12 points for a regular order or game, and best possible use case is that he does something insane in close combat or trading out chain rifle and heavy pistol. Just generally a good piece, although I will use him less in Bakunin than I would, for example, in Tunguska. Now, a warband that I do absolutely recommend, but to be used with care, is the Bakunin Uberfall Commando. We couldn't do this video without talking about her. She is a signature piece. And look, frankly, everything that I've said about her in any previous video, including the N4 Bakunin faction focus, all kind of still applies. What is worth noting is that, firstly, her Eclipse grenades no longer get a bonus. Like, compared to N4, her Eclipse bonus has lost a positive range band, which means she's throwing on 13s, which is a little bit awkward, but I feel like we're all kind of used to that now. Viral weapons are worse. Her close combat is worse. Still good, but worse. But all of that is kind of not hugely relevant because she still does the thing she did in every prior edition, which is take 3 Pupniks and then send those Pupniks into close combat, and after your opponent has declared an ARO, pick a Pupnik who is not the subject of a face-to-face roll to make an attack. And that simple interaction means that most of the time, if you start with 3 Pupniks, you will just inflict 6 saves at damage 7 onto your opponent, which for anything short of a tag is usually very threatening, because your opponent just doesn't get to ARO against the model. They don't know which model will be attacking. You run 3 Pupniks into close combat, your opponent stabs one of the other ones stabs them, the roll is not face to face, and because they're CC19, you will usually hit all 3 attacks. That simple interaction means that the sufficient investment of orders in the Chimera enables her to kill almost any model in the game, with the caveat being a sufficient investment of orders. Even at 6-4, she does still have to cross the table, and she's very, very single wound. Especially in your opponent's active turn, you have to keep her safe because she's armor 1. Like, yes, she has immunity enhanced, it doesn't matter. She's armor 1 with no cover. Any model up to and including random things with pistols are a threat to her in their active turn. In her active turn, however, she is an apex predator. Now, despite all of that, I don't recommend windmill slamming her into every list. She's a piece that you have to learn how to use. You have to learn how those interactions work. You have to learn how to make the best use out of Pupniks in your opponent's active turn, because Pupniks can be very annoying to kill and are 1-point models. And you have to learn how to move her in ways that get smoke down for her, support her, get her into close combat, get the Pupniks into close combat, all in ways that don't drain your entire order pool. You can absolutely have turns with her where she gets a fantastic kill, and it costs 8 orders and that's all that she does. Managing your timing with her, your execution with her, the tempo of how she plays, and her vulnerability, all of that is very important. She's a high skill cap piece, which means that if you're just starting Bakunin, don't take her just yet. Once you have some games under your belt, take her, play her a few times. If she doesn't perform, stick with her. If she overperforms, moderate your expectations. Eventually, you will get her down. You will know what she's capable of, how she does what she does, and when. And she will become, at that point, kind of a staple piece. But there's a learning curve to get there. Newer players get to her in time, but for any experienced players who have had ample use with her, you will understand why I'm rating her as highly as I do. Now, jumping from our skirmishers to our midfield troops, Bakunin is no slouch here either, although there's a fair bit of kind of just like decent discount stuff, and nothing exemplifies that more than the Zero. One of just the cheapest and most well-rounded sets of midfield profiles in the game, but ultimately, Ballistic Skill 11, manage your expectations. Yes, Mimetism 3, that's fantastic, Surprise Attack is nice, but a Ballistic Skill 11 combi rifle or boarding shotgun can let anyone down. These are not expensive profiles, bear that in mind. Mine Layer, definitely a standout profile because paramines are a huge shock to someone, ironically, relative to a shock mine. when they go off and your opponent didn't expect it. Many is going to be the case where your opponent face checks a minefield with something like a shock immune bike trooper or a tag, expecting to see shock mines, and all of a sudden, boom, paramine. That model stays where it is until you recover it. That's a huge deal. So very strongly rate the 0 mine layer as a haha, surprise, you fucked up model. Also rate particularly the Killer Hacker, 22 points for a mid-speed specialist at willpower 13, nothing wrong with that. And we're kind of struggling for Killer Hackers in Bakunin. One with surprise attack is about as good as it gets next to the Custodier. Custodier is better in absolute terms. Sometimes there's no substitute for one more negative modifier. Particularly, don't use the 0 to face check enemy repeater networks, but if you get a firewall pitcher down and you have that modifier in addition to surprise, the 0 is not a bad choice. The Forward Observer, despite being only 2 points cheaper, will see some use in some scenarios, particularly things like the new provisioning scenario, just because Forward Observer is a specialist bonus in that scenario. Now, there's a lot more to cover here, so we have to do this quickly. Branda Castro, really like him. Definitely not what he was in previous editions, but he was coked out of his brain in previous editions. Big thing to note, this is a very single wound character. You may remember him having, didn't he used to have no wounding cap? Yes, it was disgusting. These days, single wound. Still jumpy as hell, still a fantastic infiltrator, still a specialist, and the EM grenade profile is extremely trolly. You could absolutely have games where you forward infiltrate him over to just outside your opponent's deployment zone, and then lob off 4 or 5 EM grenades with spec fire hitting on 10s. That sounds hilarious. Every Bakunin player should probably do that at least once, but 27 points. And you do have to make the roll to get forward with the infiltration. And this is a guy who will absolutely go down screaming the first time he's exposed to a chain rifle in ARO. Definitely a niche piece, but a very fun piece, particularly since 6-2 move and super jump, in addition to everything else, gives him a huge amount of mobility. Fun, but a sometimes unit. A bit more bread and butter are our initiated observants, which are parachutists or infiltrators. These are among the only parachutist / drop troops in Bakunin. It is something that Bakunin is missing a little bit. The only other profile that has these is the Meteorzond, but good news, the Meteorzond is excellent in this edition. But the most common profile that we will see here are the infiltrators, in particular, the Mine Layer infiltrator. Now this model has very short range guns, usually it'll be using its breaker pistols, sometimes it's a machine gun against a high BTS opponent, but Ballistic Skill 12 puts it above the 0 a little bit, and it's got surprisingly good armor and BTS for a midfield model like this. Still obviously has mimetism. It's just one use camouflage, but it does still have Mine Layer, but really what we're getting here is it is only 18 points, and it's a Mine Layer with a deployable repeater. Now, to an extent, yes, this is a Masai Moran that we have at home, but it's a Masai Moran that we have at home. Very few other factions have access to anything that mine layers or prepares a repeater in the midfield. That is a hugely rare capability, and our hacking in Bakunin is just good enough to take advantage of it. Many will be the cases where you can do things like combine laid paramines and a deployable repeater as part of a midfield defense. Like you can build an eminently capable midfield for really relatively 2 points by layering 1 or 2 of these, 1 or 2 mine layer zeros, and for less than the average of 20 points per model. Like you can still bank a little bit towards other more expensive things. Everything is regular. All of the actual troops themselves just kind of like hang out ready to be interesting or annoying, and you have a layered deployable defense in the midfield for ultimately a fairly reasonable price. Not something that you will see in every list because you don't necessarily always want, or you can't necessarily always find the points or the space. This is still a very broad faction where we are trying to find lots of different things that we might want to include. Not every scenario calls for infiltrating deployable defenses. And ultimately, since we have very good pitches and some other pieces that do network projection as well, we don't necessarily always need the initiated observant, but it is worth remembering that Bakunin as a faction has the capability to build actually a shockingly capable midfield crumple zone consisting mostly of deployables and layering hacking area and mines. That can be very powerful, bear it in mind as an option. Now, technically probably not a midfield model, but one that I'm grouping in this category is Robin Hook, Outlaw AI. She only has forward deployment 4, but you just know that she's getting forward over the course of the game because that's her job. Ultimately, what you see there is a huge amount of text that boils down to surprisingly durable, can do a little bit of gunfighting if she absolutely has to, but mostly she is a hyper-mobile repeater with stealth. Now, 20 points is a lot to pay for that, particularly given we have things like 19 and 24 point linked pitches in this faction, but Notwithstanding the competition, she's a very cool piece and a very fun piece. And there is something to be said for, I am not going to have to make this roll. I just need to spend the orders to move her into range, at which point she will stealth quietly into zone of control, and then I will do the hacking that I need. She is not a pitcher, she is a model that can go prone, she is durable, she can survive, she can get onto a rooftop, she can go places that I couldn't necessarily land a pitcher because of line of sight. And while I absolutely wouldn't want to pay any more points for her than 20, like she's right at the limit of how much I think you can pay for a piece like this, she is extremely unique in her ability to get places and be a repeater in those places. Now, I think the cherry on top, and something if they were ever going to adjust a piece like Robin Hook, would be to do something like just give her Specialist Operative, because she's going into the midfield anyway. But in terms of models that go very nicely in the second combat group, she's one of them. Special call out in terms of weapons she has to her drop bears. Especially on a 6-2 move troop, that is a really nice piece of equipment. She is able to move aggressively forward. She's got super jump, so she can move 9 inches per jump, provided you can find the angles or parabolas for her. As the second short skill in each of those, lay down a drop bear, and just end up in a place where in, say, 2 orders, she can move 18 inches forward. That's a really, really long way. Lay down a couple of drop bears and just end up in an interesting and annoying position. It is pretty likely that she's going to run beyond the ability of your baggage models to reload her, but you could even feasibly run her as a group 2 model, able to very easily choose between getting forward and being a repeater, or staying a little bit closer to your deployment zone, but laying down some drop bears with spare group 2 orders prior to making a more committed run. Now, finally, in the midfield category, and easily the most niche of these pieces, we have Prowlers. And technically, the Prowler Killer Hacker is the best Killer Hacker in the faction. Compared to a Reverend Custodier, it has the same willpower, it has more BTS, and it has Surprise. It's also 30 points, and 30 points is very expensive. Now, despite that, I have absolutely had games against me in prior editions just blown open by things like the Prowler Spitfire, appearing in a location that I didn't expect, moving aggressively, hitting my deployment zone, getting enfilade fire, stuff like that. And I cannot help but admit that I have a soft spot for the idea of a hidden deployment model with disco balls. I can't remotely tell you what the game state is where that model blows the game open and wins, but I am sure that it exists. But these guys, a little bit like pieces like Branda Castro, just kind of a vanity pick. Take them only occasionally, be judicious with them, consider not using hidden deployment some of the time, since otherwise they are indistinguishable from zeros. But ultimately, there are enough different skills that aren't quite doing enough different things. These guys are expensive, right? 1.5 SWC and 36 points is the same kind of points that we would be spending on a model like a Penitent Observant or Cassandra Kusanagi. And as much as camouflage is cool and hidden deployment is cool, that is a really, really hard comparison to make when we're looking at things like the Prowlers. Now from here we jump to our tactical armored gears, of which Bakunin has 2, and both are great. The Lizard Squadron is the second best tag with a repeater in the game. And that's actually totally fine, because the best tag with a repeater in the game is the recently updated Iguana, and that thing is cracked. Now, the repeater by comparison is much more sensible, but is still really good. A repeater on a tag is fantastic. There are so many things that a tag does that just having an extremely durable repeater, even if it's just to have it in place so that you can put white noise down whenever you need to take a face-to-face roll against an enemy model with marksmanship or an MSV, it's just valuable. And on top of that, we're getting a platform that is very efficient otherwise. These models still have tactical awareness, it is a full main battle tag kind of kit, armor 8, BTS 6, 3 structure, ballistic skill 14, multi-HMG. And if all of that wasn't enough, 65 points is very affordable, and we get an EM grenade launcher. Now, you can choose between an EM grenade launcher and a heavy flamethrower. I kind of recommend the EM grenade launcher. In Bakunin, especially if you're paying for a tag, you'll have proportionally more things at the low end. A Lizard Squadron list is one that's likely to include more Morlocks, things like Dan McConnelly, so you really don't need close-in defense as much, and Ballistic Skill 14 Electromagnetic Specfire can just randomly win games. If your opponent null deploys and you go, oh well, I guess I need to spend orders somehow, the only thing that is better than stuff like a Mine Dispenser, which the Iguana has, is a high ballistic skill specfire platform. It's not always going to do things. Sometimes it will just fail to hit anything because it's ballistic skill 14 minus 6 is going to be rolling to hit on 8s. but it can also just randomly win the game. And I will take that over a heavy flamethrower that is sensible and consistent. Nope, I'll take the high roll and the ability to punish null deployments. Now, a bit less sensible and a bit more interesting and wild is the Stigmata of the Observance. My thoughts on this kind of thing have matured a little bit, I think, since prior editions. There's a lot to recommend about the Stigmata. It's a remote presence tag. It's a tag that's a hacker. It's a tag that's a hacker. It's a tag that's a hacker, and it's ECM, and it can feasibly even be given a firewall with fairy dust if you want. That's that's really quite interesting. It's a 3-wound armor 6 BTS 6 hacker with ECM, and it has tactical awareness, and it can even duo if it wants. You can duo 2 stigmatons, which is more compelling than you might think. Now, a pretty common duo is to duo it with an Orphan of the Observance. There is a 21-point engineer with a repeater that just combines very nicely with the stigmata, but you can duo 2 stigmatas together, and that's probably not actually a bad idea if you intend to take active turn fights with this thing. I mentioned when we were talking about the Taskmaster that you have to be very careful about putting your gunfighting eggs in 3 dice ballistic skill 13 baskets, and the Stigmata doesn't even have modifiers to help it. What this means is that it really shouldn't be your primary gunfighting platform. It is very easy to accidentally build a Bakunin list whose gunfighting pieces are things like 1 or 2 stigmatas, a go pod, and say a Taskmaster or Cenobite heavy rocket launcher. And at that point, you've got 4 HRLs as your primary gunfighters, and maybe if you've taken 2 stigmata, you have actual burst worth of damn, but 3 dice on 13s is just highly variable at best and very failure prone at worst. What that means is that the stigmata, especially a stigmata that isn't duoed with another stigmata, should be thought of more as a secondary gunfighter or a gunfighter opportunity. Where the stigmata excels, and it is costed suitably to do this, is when it's just one of those models that you go, this is my opponent's problem. When you do something like put it on ARO, and sure, it's only Ballistic Skill 13 Burst 1 if it isn't in a duo with another Stigmata, but it's durable and it's very likely to survive 2 guts back into a position, so your opponent has to move something up to deal with it, and dealing with an Armor 6 tag still takes time. In exactly the same way, it's not a hacker that you want to spend active turn hacking on terribly much, it's just willpower 13. It doesn't have Trinity or anything like that, but if you've put a repeater network out there, for example, with an Initiate of the Observance, your opponent is not going to be able to just trivially move forward in KHD this thing. You can bring a Stigmata down by dropping a picture on its head and then trinitying it all the way to death, but you better allocate an entire turn to doing that because it's got ECM Hacker for as long as it's conscious, and you need to do 5 wounds to this thing because, yes, the first 3 wounds will knock it unconscious, but it has remote presence, and you better bet that there's going to be an engineer or at least a speedball in the wings to bring this thing down. And so what that means is the Stigmata is just a fantastic, this is my opponent's problems piece. You can do nothing but spend its tactical awareness order repositioning from turn to turn, and it still represents a really annoying element that your opponent is regularly going to have to deal with because of the threat it poses just as a reactive or a potential kind of element. Now, if you do go active with it, Burst 3, Ballistic Skill 13 is quite failure prone as far as ballistic skill attacks go, but it's 6-4 move with tactical awareness, and for attacks of opportunity, right? Enfilade shots against models out of cover, moving up the side of a board, just firing at something that your opponent didn't think you could fire at, or who have they been forced to expose. That's totally fine. It's just not going to win a gunfight against an enemy primary gunfighter with anything nearly like enough regularity. If you keep in mind that often for like the first turn or two, its main job is just to be a huge pain for your opponent, that is where it will do the most work, and at 56 points, that's totally fine. Now, we haven't covered everything, but we are well past the hour mark. Just to mention a few more things, Scene Eater Observance. Little bit of a meme piece for much of the game's existence, and look, frankly, it's still very difficult to spend this many points on a model that can't fight in active, but they're the kind of piece that's worth playing just occasionally. Rare is the miniature in N5 even that can just win face-to-face rolls in reactive turn, and something like the Sin Eater HMG is one of those pieces. You can just win face-to-face rolls in reactive. Tags can spool up on this guy and not expect to have a favored gunfight. Now, I would say probably any of these profiles except the multi-sniper are things that you could feasibly use in different situations. I lean toward the HMG because the primary goal of a reactive piece like this is to just make sure that your opponent does not win face-to-face rolls. Even if the multi-sniper has a higher ceiling on what it can roll, just lots of dice with the HMG goes the furthest in guaranteeing that you win the face-to-face roll or don't lose the face-to-face roll, and every time you go as far as not losing the face-to-face roll, you waste an order from your opponent. Is this a good regiment? It's just 28 points for the more expensive profiles. That's quite a lot, especially for a model that can't really fight in active turn. Isn't always guaranteed to have a good deployment spot. Bit inconsistent. Can just lose the first face-to-face roll and die. But still a piece that I think is at least worth people experimenting with, and it would be remiss of me not to at least call it out as interesting because there's nothing else in the game that is BS13 Mimetism 3 and 4 dice in ARO. And finally, because they are cool and I love them, Zoe and Pywell. Ultimately, I kind of think these two are more of a vanilla element than a Bakunin element. And Pywell is a little bit weird this edition in terms of how applicable he is, but even setting all of that aside, the fact that they don't really have link teams that they want to join because they don't really fit into a moderator link or anything the moderator link is doing, Zoe is a model that does one of those very rare things, which is compellingly combine two different roles into one trooper. She's a willpower 15 engineer, and she's a really quite good hacker. Whip 15, BTS 3, she's a regular hacking device, but she has 0 pain, which means that if you are doing anything that warrants having an engineer, and you aren't taking one of the existing options, things like an orphan to duo with a stigmata, or a clockmaker to fireteam Haris, or core rather with moderators, and a cyclone or a Vostok, and you still do need an engineer, she gives you really a very good hacker and an engineer for 23 points. That's very compelling. In Bakunin, there are only so many actual use cases because there are those other two engineers that slot more neatly into things we might want an engineer for, but there is nothing wrong with the classic total reaction bot, helper bot, and hacker, engineer, and Zoe is a hacker and an engineer, combining two useful roles into one trooper. Now, Pywell, as noted, is a little bit weird. Theoretically, 19 points for a forward observer remote and all of the forward observer remote things, plus Mimetism 6 and ETM hacker is kind of interesting. But this is Bakunin, which means it's a faction with Stemplazons, which means it has an 18-point tactical awareness Stemplazon, and all of the things that I want a forward observer remote to do in N5, useful things, things that involve sensors and deactivators. Well, firstly, they don't require Mimetism 6, and secondly, Pywell doesn't have a deactivator. And thirdly, the Stemplazond is 1 point cheaper and has tactical awareness. So I'm leaning towards Pywell FTO considerably less this edition. Pywell Sync is theoretically very cool, but also kind of just not necessary. He can only be taken with the 26-point Zoe, and I'd much rather just take the 23-point boarding shotgun Zoe since her only job is going to be to sit on a rooftop somewhere near a total reaction remote, making hacking attacks and arrows and doing engineering stuff. So Pywell, a little bit less relevant. Zoe, particularly the cheapest 23-point Zoe, combines two battlefield roles into one model and is really cool. Now, wrapping the video up as we always do with a sample Bakunin list. This is one where we're actually going to show off two basic variants of the same general concept. The idea here began with penitents are really, really cool, but do we actually have to link them? Wait, what is their availability? It's 3. Well, I can't afford 3, but I could take 2. What is a Bakunin list that just slams 2 penitents unlinked in and expects them to do things look like? And it turns out that you can still fit quite a lot in. Now, although this list began with 2 penitents, question mark, question mark, question mark, profit, we'll talk about also probably a more sensible change that you could make, specifically with the inclusion of Kusanagi. But the first version of the list starts with a penitent. In both cases, these are both going to be the 37-point profiles, which means that we've got the AP Spitfire with continuous damage, terrifying, dangerous, warhorse, Mim 3, etc. There is one in each combat group, and this is a 9-6 split, because I do genuinely expect the second combat group to need all of those orders, but you could always move things around if you needed. We then have a Chimera. Again, if you are a newer player, consider cutting the Chimera for just something that's a bit more sensible and easy to use, something like an 18-point Mine Layer, or Observant, something like that. That could be a better use of this slot if you don't think you're confident using the Chimera, but Observance, so Bakunin players should learn to use it eventually, and it is a very powerful piece. We then have the Taskmaster with Morlock team. Now for SWC reasons, I'm running the Red Fury Taskmaster. To note, it could become a lieutenant. The Red Fury Taskmaster is a legal lieutenant profile, and while I would like to take the HMG if I had the option, since I have so many other Spitfire range band weapons, there just wasn't the SWC in this case. And there are compensations for taking the lower power gun. Crazy Koalas are a much more attractive deployable, and the Tinbot Firewall is nice to have. And since he's linked with two Morlocks, he'll be moving up the field anyway. He is linked with two Morlocks. One of them is the Assault Pistol profile, one of them is the EMCW, because I don't really think we need two Assault Pistols in the Link team. The EM is better close combat payoff, but pick whichever ones you like the most. We then have a Salute, Deactivator, Baggage Bot. There's a lot of things in this list that we can potentially reload. Uhahu, now she's not linked here. She is present because she is a 19-point hacking device plus. I am willing to fire off pitches with her if I think I need to, but much of the time she'll be in a more passive position, particularly doing things like throwing up white noise or providing hacking AROs. We then have two moderators, one lieutenant and one regular. One change you could consider making to this list if you were feeling spicy is to turn the Taskmaster into your LT and just cut one of these moderators for something cheaper. Cut the lieutenant, leave the decoy that will look a lot like a lieutenant and maybe cause your opponent to go after it. However, since this Taskmaster is a Red Fury profile, it's going to be moving forward. You can't really be passive with it successfully that often. Probably easier just to have the classic Moderator, LT, and Decoy. In Group 2, we then have our Fireteam Core. This is a Reverend Fireteam with 4 troopers. All of them count as Reverends, so they'll be getting +1 ballistic skill. We have a Moira multi-sniper. Now, one of the changes we will consider is to cut the multi-sniper for a HMG by finding a couple of points. We'll show that off just after this. But in this case, the multi-sniper is for 2 reasons. The first is, since she's ballistic skill 13, because of the link team size, I'm a little more willing to wear the lower burst, although I don't love it, but it has very long range bands, some scenarios like that these days, and it is more threatening to models where the DA or AP ammunition matters. We then have a Cenobite, because they're fantastic. I could very reasonably consider using the NCO order on the Moira, move this team around a little bit, and then at some point just fling the Cenobite off. That will cost 1 point of ballistic skill off of the Moira, since it's bringing the team from 4 to 3, but don't be afraid to go on a kill run with this model. We have a Reverend Healer, it's got an E-meta, a very good medikit, it's a doctor. I like pieces like this in Group 2 if they have enough regular orders, because it can move around doing like Force Reconstitution at 8 to 16 inches with the Burst 3 medikit, or Burst 2+1, but you get the idea. But this is also a model that you could consider cutting. 29 points could be easily replaced with another Cenobite or another Reverend Custodier, and still have 4 points of fireteam bonus, getting the Moira up to ballistic skill 13. This would be something to test, mileage may vary. I wanted a more well-rounded team since this is a showcase list. We then have Reverend Custodier. This is the only KHD in the list. It is, however, a linked ballistic skill 13 pitcher and a serviceable KHD. It is definitely possible for this list to lose the hacking war. However, it isn't running an aggressively large number of heavy infantry. Well, I mean, it kind of is, actually, but some of them have stealth and some of them have ECM. You just have to deal with that. This is more what I would call just enough hacking. One really good hacking device plus, one serviceable killer hacker, your own network projection. That will keep your foot in the door of the hacking game without committing heavily to it. We then have another Morlock in Group 2. Much of the time, this is going to be one of only 2 troopers that is irregular for most of the game. The other is the Chimera, because these 2 Morlocks are in a fire team. This Morlock is mostly there to run around and throw smoke and have its irregular order converted, but there will absolutely be turns where you want to just go on a run, and an impetuous activation plus 6 orders usually is just enough to get something done with an assault pistol Morlock. While I'm mentioning order count, something to note is, although this is the more constrained order group, this is a Reverend Moira, which means it has an NCO, which means that if this fire team needs it, it has 7 orders to spend. So it can move forward and it can be aggressive, or it can adopt a more passive posture, just doing things like taking long-range shots and firing off medikit shots with the healer, and firing off pitches with the Custodier, and then reloading those with the Salute. Finally, we have our second Penitent, as mentioned. And so in total, this is a list with multiple dangerous mimetism gunfighters, and white noise, and lots of close combat, and some mines, and lots of Armor 5 heavy infantry, and lots of warbands, and a fairly reasonable order pool, in particular a pretty reasonable regular order pool with only 2 irregular models for much of the game. Now, it does have a couple of downsides. The biggest one is that there are not many specialists. Uhahu is a specialist, the Reverend Healer and the Custodier are specialists. That isn't going to cut it in every game. In addition, as much as Penitents are kind of terrifying, it's pretty likely that 2 of them are a little bit of a meme. As a result, a change that we probably should very strongly consider is this version. Now, the only changes that we have made is that we've lost one of the Penitents, we've changed the Reverend Moira out from a sniper to a heavy machine gun, more reliable for active turn shooting, and we've added Cassandra Kusanagi. She is ballistic skill 14 rather than 13, she's non-hackable, she's rheumatism 6, she's a specialist operative, she does, realistically, round the list out a little bit better than the Penitent did. It's also, if I'm being very honest, much more likely that any given Bakunin player owns 1 Penitent and a Kusanagi than they are to own 2 Penitents. Given that you can only get the Penitent as part of a box set, it seems pretty likely to be that this version, in addition to including an extra specialist, being a bit more well-rounded, will be much easier on most players' collections. Now, unsurprisingly, given the breadth of Bakunin, this has been a fairly long video, so we will wrap up there. Big thanks again to both Isaac and Lindsay for the request for this faction topic. Hope very much that you've enjoyed it. And as usual, for everyone, we have Infinity videos out every week, and so I'll be back next week with more Infinity content. Till then, hope you have a good time. I'll see you next time.